Henry VIII hijacked English history. Yet at his birth in 1491 it seemed unlikely that this second son of Henry VII would ever be king. However, in 1502 his 16-year-old brother Arthur died, leaving Henry to inherit not only Arthur's position as heir to the throne, but also his widow, Catherine of Aragon, as a future wife. Henry VII died in April 1509. The new king, just 18, was a vigorous contrast to his sober parent. Athletic, intelligent, a scholar, theologian, musician, and poet, Henry personified Renaissance man, yet he disliked dealing with detail. What Henry saw was the big picture, with himself at the center. Henry's two driving ambitions were to rival Europe's foremost leaders, the kings of France and Spain, and the Holy Roman Emperor, and to continue the Tudor line by producing an heir. On New Year's Day, 1511, he had his heart's desire, a son, but the child was dead within 2 months. Bitterly disappointed, Henry threw himself into preparing for war, displaying his martial skills at lavish jousting tournaments. Henry's campaigns in France achieved frustratingly little, while costing the fortune his father had so carefully amassed. His absence also tempted the Scots to invade and come to grief at Flodden in 1513. Yet Henry had his success too. Fascinated by ships and guns, he turned the navy into a powerful fighting force. He won from the Pope the title Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith, for responding to criticisms of the Church by the Protestant Martin Luther. He picked astute men like Cardinal Wolsey to run his government. Yet still Henry had no male heir. A daughter, Mary, arrived in 1516, but he needed a legitimate son, and Catherine was too old to provide one. Thus began Henry's marriage marathon. His break with Rome paved the way for England to become a Protestant country. Although the king continued to think himself a good Catholic, those who failed to toe Henry's line, including Thomas More and rebels roused in 1536 by the destruction of the monasteries, were shown no mercy. A bloated, raging tyrant had replaced the much-admired young king. In 1537, Henry finally had his son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour. The old king died in 1547, having failed to fulfill the golden promise of his youth. Yet his legacy was an image of kingship unequaled in English history, and 3 children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, to fulfill the Tudor destiny. The youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine of Aragon was well aware that her role as Henry's queen was to bear children. A son arrived in 1511, but sadly lived only a few weeks. 5 other pregnancies produced only 1 surviving child. Mary, in 1516, desperate for a son, Henry's affections began to wander, and in 1519 his mistress Elizabeth Blount gave birth to a boy named Henry Fitzroy. Henry possibly had a view to making the boy his heir, since by the 1520s Catherine's hopes of bearing a son were slight. The king became convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his brother Arthur's widow, even though the Pope had given permission, and he had also fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, a man who was the defender of the faith, all about Catholicism and making sure that the Catholic Church stayed in power, all-powerful in England. Pictured here on your screen, 8 different times. These are the portraits of himself that he had commissioned. He was said to be a great athlete with huge calves and an insatiable appetite. This man, at this point in our story, has a wife who belonged to his brother. In death, he took up the marriage to save the treaty between Spain and England. When he takes the treaty, he continues to try and have an heir to the throne so that the Tudor line can continue, and sadly only has a young girl with this queen of his, Catherine of Aragon. So let us continue in our story. The king became convinced that God was punishing him, and he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. No great beauty, Anne was witty, vivacious, and bewitching. She at first resisted Henry's advances, but by the end of 1532 was pregnant. Henry demanded a divorce from Catherine, rejecting papal authority and getting Archbishop Cranmer to give him a decree of nullity. His great matter destroyed loyal servants such as Wolsey and Thomas More, while the Act of Supremacy made him head of the Church in England. So, in one basic fell swoop, Henry finds his affections with a lady named Anne Boleyn. She becomes pregnant. He destroys the Catholic Church in England, naming himself as head of the Church in England, and he alienates several supporters. Henry and Anne married secretly in January of 1533, and in September Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Bitterly disappointed, Henry's anguish increased when Anne miscarried twice more, the second time with a son. Anne had failed him. He readily listened to whispers of her adultery with 5 men, one of whom was alleged to be her brother. Anne was beheaded in May of 1536. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, a sweet-natured woman of 27, but the king's joy at their son's birth in October 1537 was short-lived, for his entirely beloved Jane died of childbed fever less than a week later, leaving him grief-stricken. So at this point, we're looking at wife number 3, who's just passed away. He has 2 daughters and a son. And in his 4th marriage, in 1540, he was a diplomatic match. He had seen only a portrait of the Protestant princess Anne of Cleves, and was downcast when they met. "I like her not," he told Thomas Cromwell. The marriage was not consummated, and a speedy divorce amicably arranged. Henry's eye next fell on one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, only 19, but already adventurous. She was an easy tool of her ambitious family. 19 days after his divorce, the aging king married her, but Catherine's indiscreet amours continued, and when her enemies told the cuckolded Henry, he wept with rage and self-pity. In February 1542, Catherine followed her lovers to the block. The king married for the last time in July of 1543. Catherine Parr was a widow whose motto was, "To be useful in all I do." She proved a kind companion, nurse to the ailing monarch, and a caring stepmother to his youngest child. Edward, who was 6, and Elizabeth 10, after Henry's death on 29 January 1547, Catherine married Thomas Seymour. After marrying Thomas Seymour, her 4th husband, she bore a daughter, but like Jane Seymour before her, sickened with childbed fever and died shortly afterwards. Henry's reign began in a blaze of glory and flattery. He was the handsomest potentate I have ever set eyes on, according to one ambassador. "The whole world will talk of him," cooed another. The first royal wedding was the excuse for a celebration of epic lavishness, with magnificent banquets, music, dancing, and jousting. "Our time is spent in continual festival," Queen Catherine wrote. Basically, he came in like a lion and went out a little bit like a lamb, leaving behind Edward VI, Mary I, and eventually one of the greatest monarchs of England's time, Elizabeth. Let us take a look at some of these others. Henry VIII died, leaving a sickly son, not quite 10, to be tussled over by rival magnates. Edward VI was an intelligent man, had been older and healthier. He might have balanced the powerful forces contesting for control in the kingdom. He was entrusted to the care of his uncle, Edward Seymour, who governed England as protector until 1552, when he was ousted by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. Both men favored the religious ideas of the Protestant Reformation, which Henry VIII had kept at bay, but which the young king seems to have approved. Cranmer's English Prayer Book of 1549 was a symbol of the new era. Edward died at the age of 16 of consumption, probably made worse by the medical treatments he had been subjected to. Lady Jane Grey, desperate to stop Edward's devoutly Catholic sister Mary from becoming queen, the Duke of Northumberland tried to reroute the crown to his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary. So anxious had Edward been to preserve the Protestant succession that he had apparently signed a document making his cousin Jane his heir. Only 16, Jane was proclaimed queen in London on 9 July 1553. But within days it was clear that the country backed Mary. Although Jane, the 9 days queen, willingly gave up her unwanted crown, she was tried for treason, along with her husband, and beheaded in 1554. Mary I. While my father lives, I shall be only the Lady Mary, the most unhappy lady in Christendom. With this positive outlook, she takes the throne in 1553. Edward's enthusiastic Protestant beliefs were not shared by his older sister Mary. Declared a bastard when Henry VIII put aside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary believed her task was to restore England to the Catholicism, or the true faith. Having managed to evade marriage with Thomas Seymour, England's Lord Admiral, Mary chose as husband in 1554 the most severe Catholic ruler in Europe, Philip of Spain. Her action outraged some Protestants who, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, staged a short-lived feudal rebellion. The Duke of Suffolk, Lady Jane Grey's father, joined the rebellion and so sealed poor Jane's fate. Mary longed for a child, but like her father, endured disappointment. Soon wearying of her and of the English, Philip went home to Spain, while the Queen vented her resentment on heretics. The Protestant bishops Ridley and Latimer, who were burned at the stake in 1555, and Archbishop Cranmer in 1556. These and some 300 other victims caused people to call the Queen Bloody Mary, thus the name of the drink, and the loss in 1558 of Calais, England's last possession in France, was viewed as a national disgrace. Loveless, stubborn Mary presents a sad figure. Only in her final months, racked by illness, was she reconciled with her sister Elizabeth, whom she had accused of plotting against her. When Mary died on 17 November 1558, Elizabeth heard the news at Hatfield. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes," she said, quoting the Psalms. A precocious child, Mary was adored by her father Henry VIII, but rejected when he divorced her mother. Her religious intolerance led to persecution of Protestants and large amounts of death in England. The next of these rulers, the three children of Henry VIII, becomes one of the greatest rulers in the history of rulers. Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was born at Greenwich on 7 September 1533. When her mother was executed 3 years later, the little princess was banished from court as an unwanted bastard, but restored to the family by Henry's sixth wife, Catherine of Parr. Elizabeth survived a perilous childhood and adolescence, seen for a time by her sister, Queen Mary, as a potential threat, but shrewd and tenacious, she proved a long-time survivor, gaining the throne at 24. And reigning until her 70th year, through times both troubled and triumphant. Henry's daughter had a first-class mind, sharpened by an excellent education. Musical, well-read, and athletic, she gloried in dancing and hunting. Her father's pride and energy, as well as his fiery hair and temper, combined with her mother's coquettishness and magnetism. Yet early in life she learned to be cautious, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. Although the resulting ambiguity often exacerbated her courtiers on major issues, she was usually crystal clear. She faltered only once over the fate of her potential rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed in 1587. Elizabeth's court was seldom dull. When she smiled it was pure sunshine, but anon came a storm, and thunder fell in a wondrous manner on all alike. She put her trust in wisely chosen chief ministers who served her well. The lawyer William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and his son Robert, aided by Sir Francis Walsingham, spy master and intelligence chief. For years the Queen's choice of husband was a hot topic throughout Europe, but the only man she came near to accepting was her little frog, the clever and amusing Duke of Alençon. Marriage held too many pitfalls and loss of independence. In the end, prudence or fear held her back. She remained the Virgin Queen, taking pride in the deeds of Francis Drake and his fellow sea dogs, and delighting in the flattery of her illustrious playwrights and poets. The defeat of Spain's Armada in 1588 was the high point of her reign, occasioning an ecstasy of patriotic fervor with a semi-divine queen, Gloriana, at its center. It should also be noted that the fall of the Armada pushes Spain out of being the world's power and ushers in the time of England and its great kingdoms. In the spring of 1603, she caught a chill. "To content the people, you must go to bed," urged Robert Cecil. Her reply was the defining characteristic of her, a defining quote. "Little man, is must a word to be addressed to a princess?" was her acidly genuine response. She died at Richmond on 24th March 1603, and with her ended not just the Tudor dynasty, but the richly patterned golden age of English history that carries Elizabeth's name, the Elizabethan age. The Queen enjoyed the theater. In 1575 she had visited Kenilworth Castle for 3 weeks of pageantry, a spectacle that the young William Shakespeare, then 11, may have been brought to see. By 1592 Shakespeare was in London, and his plays were performed before the Queen, as well as in the splendid New Globe Theatre. London's finest opened in 1599. Elizabeth is said to have enjoyed the character of Falstaff in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 so much that the playwright wrote the Fat Knight into a new comedy, The Merry Wives of Windsor. The Queen would like everyone to be in love with her, a comment by a foreign ambassador in London. And essentially, this woman captivated the hearts of England. That is our time for today. Thank you for listening to the story. If you're in class following along, I greatly appreciate that. And I look forward to having a discussion about the impact of the English Protestant Reformation and the beginnings of the Anglican Church.